Our first speaker is Leena Sharma Seth, a racialized settler ally, a daughter of Punjabi East Indian immigrants, and founder of Mending the Chasm. Leena is an experienced facilitator, coach, trainer, and speaker. With over 20 years of experience in various leadership roles in Canada and Asia, Leena has worked in nonprofit consulting, education, philanthropy, and supplier diversity spaces. She has leveraged her entrepreneurial spirit and her intuitive ability to create authentically inclusive organizations to produce meaningful, cultural, transformative, and impact. Leena's work in community building has been recognized by the 2021 Mayor's Community Service Award through the Burlington Chamber of Commerce, Karina Gould's Sesquicentennial Citizenship Award, as well as the Women's Center of Halton 150 Years of Exemplary Women Award. Leena is proud to call Burlington home and is raising 2 daughters and social justice warriors with her partner Sanjay. We are thrilled she is joining us today. Welcome, Leena. Welcome to the event.
Thanks so much, Terry. I just need to be able to share my slides and we can get started. Awesome, thank you. Sorry, starting too early. So thank you for this opportunity. It's a privilege to be in community with one of my community's fellow business owners. And I'm looking forward to some of the conversations we'll have today and appreciating some of the folks who are in the audience, who are friends. Welcome and happy to be with you. So I appreciate that we opened with a land acknowledgement, and I offer a continued reflection. For me, when I hear land acknowledgement, I work really hard for it not to become something that is a box checking activity. I try to take the time, and you see here I've offered native-land.ca as a fantastic resource for folks to learn more about the land that we're on and the Indigenous communities who have been stewards long before our people arrived. And so some questions that I sit with whenever I hear land acknowledgement is, whose land am I living on? What are my responsibilities as a treaty partner? Especially in light of everything that's unfolded this year with respect to the uncovering of children's graves at residential schools. I also think about how I engage with my responsibility for truth and reconciliation. So those are some of the, as someone who is an aspiring settler ally, these are some of the questions that I hold and opportunities that I lean into when I hear a land acknowledgement. So I appreciate that I'm here today to talk about how we can center, how you can better center inclusion and equity in your business practice. I want to start with a question that I invite you to hold on to as we move through this conversation. What's your why in committing to inclusion, equity, anti-racism, accessibility, and belonging work? I think about the words of Simon Sinek that, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And so as we consider what we can do as leaders to center inclusion and equity, I really do believe that, I appreciate that, Terry, you said 80% of your membership, of the Chamber's membership, is small business. And so we have more influence than we think. And the other lingering question is, how will you take your place in this movement for inclusion that we're really in terms of the times that we're in right now? So in terms of why, I wanted to share this ikigai image. It's a Japanese concept meaning a reason for being. And so for you to appreciate, I know my bio was shared, but in terms of my own why, this was part of what propelled me 2.5 years ago to launch my own business. And so for me, it lies at the intersection of these pieces. So for love, my lived experience as someone who's living in a racialized and female identifying body, my training in conflict management and facilitation, and my experience as a community mediator for the last decade. So those were part of the, why there was a passion for me in this place. What I'm good at, my career in community building, my roots in social justice and working in startup cultures. And then thinking about the need, I really have become conscious of the need or the hunger that there is in community for connection, healing, and building awareness around inclusion, equity, anti-racism, especially with all that's unfolded since the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last year and a half. It's something that I've really become conscious of. And so, of course, then what can you get paid for? So that's, of course, I can't say I knew that when I took the leap in terms of how things would unfold, but feeling really grateful for the leaders and the organizations and the companies who've really exemplified a readiness to do this work in this moment. And so hopefully many of you have heard this quote of, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I'm grateful to Vernee Myers. She's the Vice President of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix. And so, you hear this quote and I imagine it seems simple enough, right? So what I'd like to do is unpack this. And so I will move on to the first part is diversity is being invited to the party. So take a moment and I want you to conjure up an image of what party means to you. So I'll give you a moment, a couple of seconds just to kind of think about. And I appreciate that we're living through a pandemic right now. And for many of us, a party besides a virtual party may feel like it's still, we haven't returned to what parties in pre-pandemic looked like. Some of us haven't, but consider what that looks like for you when you think of the word party. Is this what comes to mind for you when you think of the word party? Or is it this? Or maybe it's this. So clearly we all have different definitions about what party looks like, the word party. I ask myself, when I'm planning a party, what is the focus of the party? What food is being served? Am I considering dietary restrictions, or if someone needs halal or vegan or kosher food? Is alcohol being served? What kind of music will be played? When is the party being held? So I invite you to kind of lean into what party planning feels like and looks like when you're centering your guests, as I'd say, like a good host. So hold on to some of those questions. The next part of that quote is inclusion is being asked to dance. And so again, I'm going to invite you to conjure up, what does that look like to you when you think about, dancing? Can you envision the place you might be dancing? Are you imagining yourself doing your signature dance move? Who might you be dancing with? I'll give you a few seconds to think of that image. Is this what came to mind for you? A slow dance with somebody you love, perhaps? Or maybe is it this? You, a line dancer, really looking to get back into line dancing? Or perhaps it might even be this. And so clearly, like the idea of party, the idea of dance is a very, there's a lot of diverse interpretations of what that looks like. And this is a shout out to my Punjabi community and my roots. I also like to add something to Vernee Myers' quote. And that is that belonging is where they play your music and embrace your dancing style. And really, there's probably other interpretations. Many practitioners do feel like there could be more for this quote. So I took some liberty here. And so what does party planning have to do with centering equity and inclusion in business practice? So I'll invite you to live with the tension of that question this moment. I'll come back to this analogy of party planning as I continue to move through this presentation. So I want to focus on the 6 P's in equity, inclusion, and anti-racism work. So the 6 P's are privilege, power, postures, principles, practices, and platform. So privilege being the first one. So I invite you to look at this image. It's from Oh Happy Danny. Daniel Koch, she's a phenomenal artist who uses her art to advance understanding around social justice, racial equity. And so this is an image that came out pretty early in the pandemic, trying to, so I'm talking about the image on the right that shows 3 lived experiences of the pandemic. And so I invite you to consider which one most reflects your personal experience, your family's experience. It's important in equity work that we understand our privilege, that we understand the social location that we're moving from, the intersection of the many identities, and to also appreciate that there are outcomes. So if you're someone who identifies with that privileged existence through the pandemic, and I also identify with a privileged existence in terms of how much I've been able to protect myself and my family through this time. But to think about the disproportionate outcomes and impact of COVID-19 and many other issues, and which communities are hardest hit, who did not have the privilege of being able to work from home, who is financially insecure because of the industries that were hard hit by the pandemic, and really experiencing income insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity. So I invite you to kind of remember that understanding where we are and how much privilege we hold is really the first step to building, inclusive cultures, that it starts with each of us as leaders. The second aspect is power. So it's important to understand what power we have access to because of the privilege we hold. Our privilege could look like, I'm an educated, I've taken post-secondary education. I own my home, I'm not renting. I was raised within a two-parent home. Those are some of the non-traditional ideas of how we hold privilege. But of course, there's, what race are we? Someone who identifies as white? Are we someone who identifies as racialized? And how does that affect the way we move in the world? Are we male? Are we female? We do understand, are we gender fluid? So we do understand that certain identities hold privilege. What tables, what communities, and what decision-making processes are you a part of that you can influence because of your privilege? Who are your circles of trust, and where can you, use your influence to advance inclusion, equity, anti-racism, accessibility practice, and even policy change? The third part of the 6 Ps is postures. So I like this image of just, understanding that there's this idea of how do we hold ourselves in this work? Are we standing in the fullness of, okay, I'm an expert, I hold a lot of privilege, I know what I know. Are we leaving space in our thinking and our approach, to be curious? Are we bringing an open and malleable heart to this work? I firmly believe that my gift in terms of advancing inclusion and equity is around understanding that we need to build our ability to engage with difference in a meaningful way, to build our collective resilience, to be able to lean into conversations that involve us building solidarity across difference. So that's, when I think about postures, that looks like bringing humility to these conversations, being willing to have some of your, sacred ideas challenged, not in a way that it's meant to be defensive, but to recognize that there are other lived experiences that people bring that would really maybe challenge the story you're telling yourself about your community, about the people and communities you serve, about the staff who work with you and work for you. And it's also about building a capacity for self-reflection in this work, that we all are familiar with this, call-in culture, call-out culture. We probably all have ideas of examples of companies who perhaps did not make the right move in terms of their response to inclusion, equity, anti-racism issues. And so, of course, that can create fear around or paralysis around wanting to move forward. And I invite that, we are going to make mistakes in this work, and it is about progress over perfection. As someone who is a practitioner around inclusion and equity, it's not out of the realm of possibility that I get feedback in work I'm doing with clients that perhaps I had an oversight over, perhaps I used the wrong pronoun, and I bring humility to this work as well, that I need to model what I'm asking folks to shift to. And so I live that in terms of taking that feedback and committing to doing better. It's not about beating ourselves up for those mistakes. It's not about creating a shame, blame environment. It's about recognizing we're going to make mistakes. We're working collectively to build a future that none of us has actually lived in. So I think that gives us the space and grace to make some mistakes. And I also feel like entrepreneurs understand that well, that sometimes you're building the plane as you fly it. And so giving yourselves this, lean in on the muscles that we already have to help us to build the right postures for this work. The next P is principles. So what are the values and principles that ground your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion? And are those, would you say inclusion is a principle of yours? And I always ask, like, how does that live in practice? What you do speaks so much more loudly than anything you say. And so it's important to be aware of that. And then practices is P number 5. So what practices will you commit to resource yourself for this journey? And again, the why is a central point or part of how we, I think, resource ourselves, is that when things get hard in this work, if you do make a mistake, if your commitment, and if you're clear on your commitment and your why, it helps you to weather through those moments that are messy and complex. And so how do you prepare yourself for difficult conversations? How do you build your ability to tell the difference between when you're feeling uncomfortable and when you're feeling unsafe? Because in equity work, I think many of us shut down when we feel like something feels unsafe. That there is one of the humble pieces of awareness I bring to this work is that I try to use a trauma-informed approach. I understand that there's a lot of trauma that lives in our communities because of all of the inequity and the exclusion that people are feeling. And so I move with a consideration of creating spaces that are trauma-informed. And so that's part of why it's important to consider, what are your practices? I've heard some folks say that, I do yoga every day. I know some ways personally that I resource myself is I have a cup of tea with me. I have like a diffuser running because I'm really responsive to smells. As someone who's a practitioner, I still can get triggered in this work. And so to me, it's really important that I come to this work with my cup as full as possible so that I can hold space and walk as an inclusion partner with my clients from a place of strength. Do you have a practice of having a critical friend, someone who is a truth teller, who will tell you the truth and not just, inflate or preserve your ego? It's important in this work that you find that critical friend so that you can access humility as you work to unlearn and relearn some new stories that you're telling yourself. And the 6th P is platform. So when you consider all of the other Ps, part of what comes with privilege and power is platform. You have the ability to influence. So consider what platforms you have access to because of the privilege and power that you hold. And how can you share your insights, your experience, your passion for inclusion and equity from this place? And even better, how can you share that platform with the voices and to amplify the voices of those who are leading the movement? Because I also want to say that this work is also about us decentering ourselves. So that's another posture. It's this idea of the more power and privilege we hold and the further away we are from our own experience around supporting the movement for equity, we have to decenter ourselves. We don't take space as those holding dominant privilege. So that could be white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered. So the more privileged our identities are, the more important it is to use our platform to amplify and to give space to those voices so they can speak for themselves, because they usually know how they want to fix the problem or how they want to approach the problem. So coming back to party planning, so these are the 6 business areas that I thought we could use as a lens, and I will do my best to kind of tell the story or to share this through the analogy of a party. And so strategy, finance, operations, human resources, technology, marketing, those are the big buckets that I thought would be helpful to use to kind of talk about how can we center equity and inclusion? What does that look like? And so building on the 6 Ps, I will move into the first one, strategy. So again, I say it's really tightly tied to the why. So thinking about a party, why are you holding the party? Is it for your birthday? Is it about celebrating a specific holiday? Is it just a summer barbecue? Whatever that is, when we plan a party, we're pretty rooted in our why. And so when you think about centering inclusion, into your strategy, rather than it being like a side of the desk, a nice thing to have. It should be either embedded in your values, your principles, your mission, your vision, and also as a central force in terms of how you plan to grow and build your business. So it should be a foundational brick in the strategy that you're building. The second one is to consider budget or finance. So of course, who throws a party without a budget, right? You have to consider, the number of people who are coming, the food that you're going to be serving, where you're holding it, so really we know that we can't have a party without a budget. It's the same with inclusion, equity, and belonging work. And I use a lot of these words interchangeably because I mean them all when I am, even if I just say inclusion, for me, it includes all of those, but I want to ground you in the different words that are used to describe inclusion work. So building an equitable, inclusive, and accessible culture is going to take work, and it requires a budget. So we can no longer expect that it's something that people do off the side of their desks, or a volunteer committee that will be responsible for such a big culture shift, right? It's that idea that culture does eat strategy for breakfast, and part of how we fund it is really carving out space and resource for the work. And so I think about a quote that US President Joe Biden says that, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. I want to share a little story here that Sodexo was able to, and I know it's a bigger company, but I love the story that, exponentially they increased their return on investment through DEI initiatives. Basically, they were able to recognize that for every dollar that they invested in DEI work, it has seen a return of $19. And so I appreciate that's a bigger scale example, but just for those of you who are maybe thinking about the cost to bottom line, I invite you to pivot and consider what it adds in terms of value, in terms of expanding your market share, and that there's people who could be accessing your services and products who, because they don't see themselves in your brand and in your marketing, they're not coming to you. And so I invite a pivot that, we tend to focus on cost centers. And again, I'm mindful we're coming through a pandemic and that businesses were hit really hard. And so, let this sink in and kind of soak in and consider what shifts you can make around it, being intentional about this work. The third part is operations. So reviewing your audit and auditing your policies and practices. And I appreciate if you ask me about my policies, mine would be very scant at this point. And so I appreciate that this could look differently. So I say policies, but I also say practices. And so to consider using the business, the party analogy, where are you holding your party? Is it accessible? Can everybody get to it? Is it a psychologically safe space? Are you giving some attention to, okay, who I invite, if I need to know that they interact well, or do people trust you who are being invited to this party to keep a safe space? Is there a clear understanding of what's happening at the party, so to speak? And this is the same for policies and practices, that when people who work for you, are they clear on what your position is around inclusion and equity? Are they clear that if they experience an issue, if they experience a microaggression, on how they'll be supported? Do they feel safe enough to come and approach you as a business owner, as a boss, to be able to give that, to say, hey, I had a problem and I need some help, dealing with it. That's kind of part of the consideration. I also invite this idea of, can you cost share with other businesses? And so, when you think about policy approaches, are there folks who've already, developed policies in your circle that could help you with, or do they have practices that you're like, wow, how did you do that? And, how have you shifted to have a more inclusive, market share? How can you help us with that? Or how can we collaborate, or even share cost on bringing in an inclusion partner to help? So just to think kind of outside of the box. And I invite us to think about what we've learned from COVID. What were practices that were non-negotiable and even unthinkable before the pandemic that we've now embraced? I give a shout out to the disability justice movement, because they've been longtime advocates for flexible and accessible working options. And so really thinking about what, how that movement was, their recommendations were resisted, but now because of COVID, a lot of the recommendations have been normalized. And so that's something to think about. I also invite you to consider how you use your dollars. So what's your procurement policy? How are you deciding the suppliers that you work with? Could you use a supplier diversity lens? And I appreciate that you might individually not have, huge budgets, but as a collective, that 80%, if we were to shift and prioritize doing business with, perhaps with women or with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color vendors, how can we use our dollars to increase economic inclusion for communities that have experienced marginalization? And so one of the statistics I sit with is, did you know that less than 3% of venture capital goes to women-owned businesses? Or that women-owned businesses access less than 3% of global supply chain contracts. And this number is much less for Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. So again, I appreciate the intersectionality around how exclusion presents, that the more marginalized identities you hold, the more deeply you may be experiencing oppression or inequity. And so there's a statistic that's circulating that talks about that if women and men around the world participated equally as entrepreneurs, global GDP could ultimately rise by approximately 3 to 6%, which would boost the global economy by 2.5 trillion to 5 trillion. I don't know about you, but I don't know many places or spaces right now that couldn't use that boost. And so when you think about inclusion and equity, it's important to consider, like I said, that really we need all hands on deck right now. We can't afford, because of our inability to engage with difference, we can't afford to leave out segments of the community in this recovery. So I appreciated Karina Gold's remarks at the opening that spoke to this. The fourth area is human resources. And so the question I ask is, does your team represent the community that you serve? And how aware are you of the diversity of the community? I know we have the 2016 census data is floating around, but if you're out and about in community and seeing that diversity, but you're not seeing that translate into who frequents your establishment, are you asking yourself why? Are you noticing who's not there? Or are you content with who is showing up? So I hope that, as part of your work to kind of expand, and using the party example, that, who's being invited to the party? Does the party represent your community? Are you inviting folks who maybe are outside of the community and maybe need some help with integrating, right? Because I'm sure we've all been to space. I think about some chamber events where, and I love the consideration that the chamber offers around having folks who are ambassadors, but I'm sure all of us can appreciate the first time you went to an event and that feeling of aloneness. And perhaps if you look around and you see nobody who looks like you or moves like you, what that feels like. And so to consider how you can bring some intention. And I would never invite a business owner to start with, diversifying your staff or diversifying your team. It's about making sure the culture has shifted enough to set people up for success in that culture, rather than the culture doesn't shift, but you're bringing in diversity that hasn't, that you haven't really done the work to make sure that you have the postures, the principles, and the practices, and the insight to recognize that perhaps if your clients or your customers are used to dealing with people who look like them and move like them, but you're bringing in diverse staff, then you have to appreciate that there will be some friction. And how are you going to support that? How are you going to support employees who may have experienced racism or homophobia or a range of oppression? So it's about thinking about how are you creating opportunities for people to be successful. I'm thinking about, there's a study from MIT that found that even shifting from an all male or all female office to one that's split evenly along gender lines can increase revenue by roughly 41%. So this is it's a 2014 MIT study. And then I had a chance to look at a Glassdoor survey that came out recently that talked about that more than 3 out of 4 job seekers and employees, so that's 76%, report that a diverse workforce is an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers. So this means that whether or not your company is interested in increasing its diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments, most candidates are evaluating whether they choose your company based on some of these priorities. And so I know that we're going to be leaning into the Great Resignation a little later on. And I know from my vantage point, the intersection around that is that part of this Great Resignation is that folks who have lived experience of oppression, who are racialized, who are perhaps, from the LGBTQ community, are considering their own well-being before they choose, where they go. And so definitely that's a part of this conversation, that we're in a time right now. It's not that folks don't need jobs, but from a place of mental health, it's a very real conversation right now. And I do have a lot of roles cross my desk where folks are asking me would you please share this in your community? And for me, I'm really careful about that, because if I don't know the culture myself, I'm not going to share a role that could potentially, create harm. And so just something to be thinking about. The next business area is technology. And so I use the example with party. How are you inviting people to your party? Is it, the traditional, write an invitation and pop it in the mail? Are you using email? Are you using some online invitation platform? And how can that increase accessibility? That's a part of it. The other thing I think about is in COVID, I've actually participated, probably like many of you, in virtual celebrations. Of course, it's not the same as breaking bread, face to face, and cheers, doing a cheers all together. But it is a form of continuing to build, connection and belonging. And there's a lot of stories around how technology has improved accessibility. I think about a startup based in Toronto. They're called Nokri.com, and they are an AI-based platform intended to reduce bias in the hiring process. And so I heard, a story through an interview for one of the founders that was just talking about, and this ties more into some of the HR challenges, but he shared a story with or he said to the interviewer, who was a white male, and the co-founder is an Indian man, and he was saying that, look, you, Matthew, have a 39% chance that you'll get a call back, and when you submit your resume because of your name, and versus me, my name is Chandrasekhar. That name is not going to get, and there's if you Google the idea of what happens with last names, there's a lot of research around how that affects bias in terms of seeing someone's names. And so the beauty of a platform like Nokri is that it helps to reduce that bias. And I know that there's a lot of folks in the community who are already using technology like this, but I just wanted to animate a story, and it's a local business based out of Toronto. So wanted to give them a shout out. So the last piece is communications and marketing, right? The one thing I say is that it's really important that you communicate your commitment once you're living it. And so when we think about a party, when the best parties, that are not ones where I'm the one who's sharing the pictures of how well my party went. It's that if people have had a great experience, they're going to share the pictures themselves. And so I invite you to consider, the idea that you do have, you do want to amplify, there's a role for sharing the equity inclusion journey that your company is on, or your business is on, because I think there's an important leadership message that goes out into the community. When I initially launched my practice here in Burlington, at the beginning, I was doing work in other places. I was doing national work. I was doing work in other provinces and across North America, but I wasn't doing a lot of work here locally. And I wasn't sure what that would look like, because as someone who was a racialized leader in this community, during that time, I didn't necessarily see a lot of bandwidth or interest on the part of other leaders to have conversations about why is it that the higher up we go in leadership, the less diversity we're seeing. How come no one's asking me, my board's not asking me what my experiences are like as a racialized leader in this community, going into spaces where I am experiencing racism, I am experiencing gender bias. And so there was an appetite to talk about that, but I'm really deeply encouraged about all that's unfolded in the last year and a half, to recognize that there has been an interest and an awakening of a sorts. And so I've been working to do all I can locally, and I'm grateful for this platform that the Chamber of Commerce has provided me, as well as the award that was bestowed on my business. I'm, as you're going to see if you see me around, my commitment to this, in response to this recognition, is I'm going to use it to push as hard as I can in this moment to advance equity and inclusion. I'm raising my daughters in this community. I grew up in this community, and so I have skin in the game here, and it's important to me. And so I just offer that as you consider your work, please socialize it. If you are passionate and in the process, share that in your community, because nothing like a little bit of peer pressure, right? And the other piece around this kind of communicating it once you're living it, where a lot of businesses get in trouble is when they are quick to offer some sort of a statement, and then the work to line up your practice with your words is not there. And so some of the best, I'm going to give a shameless plug to Burlington Public Library. If you're curious about what a really good, a simple good statement could look like, go to their website and check out I think it's called Commitment to Anti-Racism. But they have a really great, it has all the ingredients of what a good statement looks like. It leads with an acknowledgement of solidarity with the community. It leads with a recognition that they have work to do. It leads with a commitment to an action plan. And even if it was a simple 1, 2, 3 steps that we're going to invest resources, we're going to do, X, Y, Z. It's important that because I think folks who have lived experience of oppression have experienced enough performative commitment where people say that they're going to do something, say that they care. I think about last summer, the Blackout Tuesday, I believe is what it was called, where folks put those black squares in their Instagram, their social media. And I know at the time I had a lot of angst about it, because I'm like, well, it's great to raise awareness. But my curiosity is, a year later, how many of those folks are still committed and still, involved in the work? And so that's, when we think about marketing and communications, it's really important that there's a reason it's the last thing that I'm suggesting as a place in your business where you can amplify, use your power and privilege to tell the story of the work that your company's doing, your business is doing, and to share even imperfection. I think about the Black North Initiative, which came out of Toronto, and I think by now over 500 companies have joined that initiative. But one of the things I really appreciated in the pledge that each person is asked to share is that you're going to talk about the mistake, where you have mistakes, or I'm going to say failures, because we want to show that this work is not going to be perfect. You are going to make mistakes. Sometimes it is about 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so just to consider that and to give yourself the space and the grace, and that when you make a mistake, that you're committed to repairing harm. And so that's where having an inclusion partner or an inclusion advisor is really helpful. So a closing thought here, this image on the left is from last summer, the Black Lives Matter march that happened here in Burlington in response to the tragic murder of George Floyd. I look at this picture and I have actually goosebumps, because I'm someone who has roots in social justice. I've been to a few marches and protests in my time, and I attended this one thinking it would be like those other experiences in terms of 30, 40, maybe 100 people, and I was like holding back tears in this on this march, because over 5,000 people in Burlington showed up. And it challenged me to tell myself a different story about my community, a story that, our community does care, especially, I'm going to say, the young people. I really do believe the virtual school experience gave me an opportunity to hear what my children were learning at school. And I was like, wow, it's a different time than the things that we were learning. And so I do feel like I'm an optimist. I feel like the future is in good hands. And I think there's work we need to do while this generation that's coming up and continues to advance from their vantage point. And so, and I also leave this quote. Martin Luther King Jr. is a leader who I deeply respect. But I leave this quote that, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So if you're a leader who's found your place in the movement to build inclusion, congratulations. Know that you're not alone. I'm happy to connect you with others in the community who are also on the journey if this helps, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you're someone who's yet to find your place, why is it that you haven't found your place in this movement? Sit with that question. And the challenge I close with is, what are you waiting for? And I have a little, I don't know if you can see over my shoulder here, I have a piece on the wall that says that exact question, because it reminds me when I feel complacent to challenge myself. So I thank you for the time here, and definitely have some space for questions. And so maybe I'll even stop the share. This is a little bit about my contact information, but happy to hold space for any questions